Hello everyone, my name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer with 11 years of experience in the industry, and I would like to rank just for fun all games from the Prince of Persia franchise. We will do so with the help of my Stasucritic scoring system, a set of ratings, each with their own criteria, the details of which are explained in the pinned comment. The list will be live. Instead of ranking from worst to best, we're going year by year and see how games compare with each other on the way. Prince of Persia is as iconic within the gaming world as it is sporadic. New games in the series are not released with any semblance of regularity, and to be quite honest, a bunch of games aren't actually as well known as perhaps they should be. I hope that this ranking will help you find some of the more underrepresented games of the series to try them out as we go through the history of Prince of Persia. The first Prince of Persia was released on practically every platform that existed during the early 90s, though in this entry we will only cover games that properly recreate the experience defined by Jordan Mechner's Apple II original. And I must say that graphically speaking, the Apple II version is often misrepresented by being shown in a pixel-perfect way. On CRTs, all these weird dithering dots actually create brick patterns in dungeons and elaborate ornaments in the palace chambers, adding depth to this seemingly simplistic art style with rotoscoped animations. Of course, the art style differs greatly from port to port as they were released across many years, from the close to the original but richer in color DOS version, to quite a different looking Japanese variants that were released on platforms like FM Towns and TurboGrafx 16. And on Sega CD there's actually voice acting in cutscenes.
Princess!
Leave us alone!
It is Master Jaffa's orders.
What?
We must arrest him.
Him? He didn't do anything wrong.
Master Jaffa will explain later. Please return to your private quarters.
He didn't do anything wrong. Stop it! Let him go!
Princess!
Not good voice acting, but it's there. Even though the differences in visual fidelity between versions can be quite big, I can't say that it amounts to any significant aesthetic gaps. After all, regardless of resolution or amount of colors used, the levels still remain relatively simplistic in their representation, which still works well for the purposes of gameplay clarity. It should also be noted that since ports back in the day usually were just separate versions created from scratch in an attempt to simulate a similar experience, they don't actually play exactly the same. For example, the Atari ST version sometimes has some weird speed-ups or slowdowns, though that never prevented comfortable play, while on TurboGrafx the ledge grab assist can snap you to the wrong floor tiles. Stuff like that can be annoying, but since even in the original version the handling of input could sometimes be wonky, I figured every platform listed in this entry sort of balances itself out to overall similar experiences anyway. Most footage you'll see will be from the DOS version, which is the Prince of Persia I personally grew up with. I remember how me and my entire family, my mom, my brother, my sisters were regularly attempting to save the princess within the allocated 1 hour, though I actually don't remember any of us reaching the end. Maybe someone did, but certainly not me until I played the game for this video. Prince of Persia is one of those games that can feel difficult to control at first, but I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. It's a perfect example of the difference between control responsiveness and control weight. Many tend to call Prince of Persia an unresponsive game, but that's not true. As soon as you press a button or a combination of those, the corresponding action animation begins to play immediately, so there is nothing wrong with input responsiveness. Now, the animations in question tend to be very long, which is why the controls feel very heavy. Prince never does anything without a process of deliberation. It takes a second just to turn around. But this is not a flaw. I'm not saying you have to like the stylistic choice, but also one can't fault the game for being inconsistent. The heaviness applies to pretty much everything, with the game's levels and obstacles built entirely around this style of character controls. Which means it's an aspect that you can master, and just like the prince applies deliberation to his animations, you instinctively become much more deliberate with what buttons you press and when. For example, in the case of a run and jump, the main character has to take several extra steps before making the leap. If you time it wrong, he can actually step to his doom into a pit. But as long as you know the timing and the amount of steps during the run-up before jumping and the distance of the jump itself, which always remain the same every time you execute the action, there is nothing preventing you from consistently doing such long jumps without any issue. Except when the input wonkiness I've mentioned kicks in. It is rare, but sometimes the game just doesn't properly process the order of your inputs, which can lead to your death. And while it is frustrating, it should be noted that the 12 levels of Prince of Persia are actually not that big. You might die often when going through each the first time, be it because of traps or guards or poor jumps, but it doesn't take long to retrace your steps from the beginning of the level. More than that, as you replay levels and get to learn them more, you find more effective routes and shortcuts that will help you save precious time as well as perhaps not take as many risks. The areas are very smartly designed, and I really appreciate how the dungeons you have to escape make you think in a three-dimensional way that takes advantage of the screen-by-screen nature of every map. For example, there is a spot where technically you have to take a leap of faith to the right, except it's not exactly a leap of faith, as if you explore the level from below, you will see pillars going upwards beyond the edge of the screen, meaning that you can deduce that there are platforms you can jump on. And again, because the levels are not big, you don't feel like you're being overwhelmed by a constant barrage of labyrinths. Every area is pretty self-contained, so it's very satisfying to discover the various pathways, both mandatory and secret, and it's reasonable precisely because of the deliberate nature of controls. Even though you have a time limit, you don't actually try to be as fast as Sonic, you look around to understand the space and how to navigate around it. This is also why the little arc with your shadow form works so well. While at certain points it will mess your progress up, the way to defeat it, which I won't spoil, is pretty clever, and since the game always teaches you to be very mindful, it doesn't feel out of place. Plus, it plays a role in Prince of Persia smartly conveying its pretty traditional story through gameplay in an engaging way. All this is why it's regrettable that the combat never really reaches that level of quality. I mean, it's fine, it's consistent, it's rhythmic, but there is rarely anything that spruces up the petty counter gameplay that you engage with every time you find a guard. Even the final boss is not that exciting in comparison to, let's say, the big guy you fight in the middle of the game. Still, the very first Prince of Persia gets a Metacritic rating of 76. It's not perfect, but there is a reason it's a classic. A simple yet compelling heroic adventure with cinematic qualities that's smartly built around a very deliberate and precise type of gameplay at which you get better every time you replay a level. If this is your cup of tea, there is no reason not to try the game if you haven't already. This entry is dedicated to ports that don't quite reach the level of quality of the original for one reason or another. Might be because, like on Amstrad CPC, the combat is quite horrible and unresponsive despite the fine platforming. Or like on Sharp X68000, everything is just slow and laggy. Or like how on the impressively looking Game Boy recreation you'll just keep crashing and bumping into everything, sometimes not making full jumps because the button wasn't pressed long enough, and while the Game Boy Color version fixes some issues, it doesn't fix all of them. Though the reasons are different, all Prince of Persia versions on these platforms get a Metacritic rating of 50. Serviceable enough, but there's far better alternatives. There are also Prince of Persia ports that are just quite bad in general. Again, the nature of problems might be different, but ultimately it leads to the same result. An experience that's not pleasant at all. Maybe it's because, like in the NES version, there is absolutely no consistency to the mechanics, and the fact that all the time there is important level elements blocked from view without screen scrolling for which you need to get closer doesn't help. The Master System and Game Gear versions try to avoid the scrolling issue by redoing the levels in such a way that everything would still fit in one screen within their resolution. But that has messed up all the carefully laid out proportions, transforming gameplay into a mess. And then there's the Genesis port, which feels like it should be fine, but it's actually the version where controls are unresponsive. There is a significant delay between your input and the beginning of Prince's animations, which makes it incredibly frustrating to tackle even the simplest of challenges. The European Genesis Mega Drive release has 4 extra levels, which usually is significant enough to change the experience and deserve a separate entry, but not here, as regardless of the amount of levels, you'll be annoyed while tackling the controls just the same. So even though for different reasons, all these Prince of Persia versions get a disappointing 37. They're technically playable and still have positives simply due to the merits of the original game, but they're really not enjoyable. Developed by RC Software, the Prince of Persia for Super Nintendo is not as much a port as it is an enhanced remake. The first sign that something's different appears at the very beginning when you are given 2 hours to save the princess instead of 1. This is because there are 20 levels in the game, not 12. But not only that, each of the original 12 levels has seen significant changes. For example, in the original game you get the sword by completing a couple of jumping challenges while going to the left. Here there's a whole sequence of delving towards an underground river before you find a dead body with a sword. There's a lot of screens that look exactly like the ones from the original game, but they might lead to a different puzzle or obstacle. So if you're like me and are playing the SNES Prince of Persia after trying out pretty much every other port out there, prepare for your muscle memory to mess you up. And this is not a criticism, the amount of surprises is actually very pleasant. Even when some things might not make sense in comparison. Like for example, when your shadow form blocks a jump, in the original you fall down onto a deeper dungeon level, but here you sort of fall into literal hell you have to climb out of. It might feel jarring, but I actually like it because it creates a much bigger contrast and therefore a stronger emotional response. Plus, just because it doesn't fit the original Prince of Persia doesn't mean it's out of place in this version, where Jafar's magic usage is far more prominent. And of course, the added variety is always welcome. The amount of obstacles used in the original Prince of Persia could get a bit stale by the end of the game, though ultimately that wasn't too problematic due to its length. Still, the SNES Prince of Persia has tons of new traps, lots of interesting new secrets and situations, cool ways to get upgrades, twists on old locations for people familiar with the original. There is just a lot of really great stuff, and most importantly, it doesn't feel like the game overstays its welcome, or that the pacing suffers, or that some special moments like the skeleton fight in level 3 become less impactful. Everything fits just so well. It is a bit sad that the sword fighting hasn't really seen any improvements at all, though the amount of interesting combat situations has increased. I particularly enjoyed the 6-armed god boss who doesn't try to hit you directly, but rather through skulls that fall down when he jumps. There is a bit of a negative side effects to levels becoming longer. If you die, it takes more time to get back to where you were. Now, in many levels there are actually checkpoints that respawn you mid-level. However, it doesn't seem that all levels have that, and when they don't, it can get pretty annoying. But what makes the act of replaying levels in such situations more bearable are the perfected controls. I haven't encountered a single situation where Prince wouldn't be responsive to my commands or not follow my exact inputs. This is certainly the best implementation of the original game's core mechanics, and since the levels are still focused on deliberate search of more effective and safe routes, with every retry you get to successfully cut down the time spent reaching your last location. What I like the most about this version is that even though it doesn't add lots of set pieces or cutscenes, and most of the levels are pretty self-contained, it still feels pretty epic in scope thanks to the music and visuals, and the animations are as strong as ever in the franchise. I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 85 to this version of Prince of Persia. If you can play only one variant of the original game, it has to be this one. It's Prince of Persia on steroids. A great journey that's as enjoyable to play as the original while upping the ante and living up to the cinematic potential. The first Prince of Persia is undeniably a classic, and it's still a good game that I could recommend even today. Though I would more gladly recommend the SNES Remake, it's just awesome and ahead of its time. While not immediately, Prince of Persia became popular enough that of course it spawned sequels, which we will discuss in the next video.